Hello everyone, welcome back to Hearing Her Voice. As part of a student organization at UCSD, we cannot forget the discussion about sexual assault on our first podcast with Dr. Anita Raj. We talked about how first and second generation college students might be dissuaded to continue their education after a sexual harassment or assault. These traumatic experiences simply add huge weight and stress onto them, which give them a hard time to continue pursuing their education. While Dr. Anita Raj has sent us a list of sexual assault resources, not only for UCSD students, but also for our non-UCSD listeners, we wanted to use this podcast, Hearing Her Voice, to hear from those who are trained to help those who are going through traumatic experiences. We are honored to have Kristina Mendez from UCSD CAPS, which stands for Counseling and Psychological Services. She is currently a postdoctoral resident at UCSD and has great interest in Latinx students, chronic stress related to systematic oppression, and more. We had a great time talking with her, and we hope you enjoy it as well.
Now we're on live or on recording.
Hi, my name is Scarlett. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with Jinho, Jung, and Kristina Mendez.
Hello.
We're here to talk about CAPS and about her story and about other things. So would you like to talk about yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so thank you so much. Oh, thanks so much for having me. Again, my name is Dr. Kristina Mendez. I go by she, her, hers pronouns, ella en español. I identify as a bilingual psychologist in training almost. I'm a postdoctoral resident right now. So bilingual mental health professional rather. I identify as a community-oriented provider, trauma-informed provider, and feminist multicultural-oriented provider. And I'll probably unpack that a little bit with some of the things we'll be talking about today. But yeah, I'm passionate about serving communities, dismantling systems of oppression, and supporting our students and folks within the bigger community as a part of that. So I'm so happy to be here and be part of this awesome cause.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you talked about how you're passionate about serving these communities, and then there are just a lot of ways to serve the communities, like being a social worker or being a researcher. What made you specifically interested in this field of psychology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's so many different ways to be a community activist, an advocate, and person in service of communities. And I think, for each person, the path can look different, but still have humongous impacts. For me, I ended up going with psychology, specifically a doctorate program, because I knew I wanted to do research to help advocate and uplift particularly BIPOC communities and especially Spanish-speaking communities in the US. And so I knew that I wanted to kind of put out research and have people listen to my voice as we're talking about in here. And, a lot's starting to change in terms of, empowering woman-identified folks and BIPOC providers. But nonetheless, when I started, it was kind of this idea of if you want to be heard, you have to get a PhD, which is, a colonial, oppressive, hierarchical system to begin with. But I got my PhD so that, the world could hear me roar in that sense. And I knew that I wanted to do some therapy work, but also a lot of research and possibly teaching and community organizing. And so for me, a doctorate program offered that. I know for social work, I have so many colleagues who are social workers and do amazing work in communities. And there's so much that you can do related to that, just less of an emphasis on research and a different kind of emphasis on one-on-one client work. And I know a lot of folks who are educators as well and can do very similar work. So I work with a lot of folks from different fields, both here at UCSD, but also in my work in community research and at different universities and organizations. So, I chose my path because of, specific interests that I had. And I want to advocate that there's so many wonderful intersecting professions that can collaborate together to make bigger social change.
Oh, wow.
So Kristina, can you tell us an experience that you had while doing research, like something that you just think it's memorable that you can share with us, either that you encountered with someone or some research that you found out that potentially has helped the community and could possibly also help be heard through here.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love having, platform to amplify all that. Well, I'll say a lot of work that I've done has related to yoga and mindfulness-based intervention, particularly in like Latinx communities, predominantly immigrant communities and a lot of newcomer immigrant communities. So folks who have come to the US, or at least what's considered to be the US by more modern borders in recent years. And so the research that I did in part was helping to deliver mindfulness and yoga programming as preventive wellness. So for stress reduction, for coping skills, for accessible tools for well-being, because we know there's a lot of barriers to BIPOC folks accessing care. And so the great thing about mindfulness is that once it's taught, there's also a lot of barriers to sometimes accessing that. But once you have access to it, it's a tool that you have internally and you can practice wherever you're at. And so in working with communities, I realized that there were some adaptations that could be helpful to make practices more personable or accessible. And so for some of my research for my dissertation, I made some language adaptations and bilingual program adaptations to teach to predominantly Spanish-speaking newcomer immigrants. And so was able to also integrate some English language learning components because they were also interested in learning English in their school program. And so just integrated some different means of learning that was accessible to the students so that it would be understandable, easy to practice, and then also bringing in qualities of like warmth and reminding the field that building relationship is so important with communities and building trust and trauma-informed care and practice because of everything that folks go through, one as BIPOC individuals in the US, and also as immigrants from anywhere. There can be so many stressors coming to the US. And everyone's story is different. This was just for the youth that I worked with. So some great outcomes were, hearing that it was well received by folks and seeing opportunities to replicate and train other people in that. I really am passionate about kind of train the trainer model. So I've had opportunities to train other providers in these methodologies and to continue writing about ways to kind of like spread opportunities for preventive well-being. It was a long answer.
It was wonderful. Maybe for our listeners, BIPOC means Black, Indigenous people of color. And then,
Yes.
So I'm guessing like if we sign up for a counseling session with you, will you be doing yoga with us?
That's a good question. So for me, my journey more recently with yoga has been one of a lot of self-reflection. I identify as Latina and I'm mixed race or ethnicity, also white. And, yoga is not from my ancestral traditions. And so in learning yoga, I was fortunate to have learned from traditions that were brought over by teachers who wanted it to be shared. And nonetheless, the tradition as a whole has been colonized and appropriated so much in recent years. And so with yoga, after I'm still sitting and reflecting and learning and humbling myself, I do my best to teach it, honoring the spectrum of what it is intended to be, which is more than just physical movement, a whole lot more, right? So in the West, when you think of yoga, you might think of oftentimes portrayed as like a tall, skinny, blonde white woman in, fancy, expensive clothes, doing like some super bendy posture. And so, for me, as I integrate yoga into a lot of the things that I do, yoga is about being connected, being present, being attuned to the world around us and in reciprocal understanding and relationship. And I think that relates to a lot of, what a lot of Indigenous traditions value as well. And so I bring in yoga in my therapy through mindfulness, through breathing, through helping my clients trust their intuition again and get connected with their own ancestral lineages and the world around them. So in that sense, yes, I bring yoga in. I do have a forum called Yoga for Wellness where I integrate some gentle movement. But my emphasis is when I bring in yoga, it's about the holistic picture rather than kind of the Eurocentric, like physical movement image kind of picture. And still always humbling myself and doing the best I can.
Okay.
I think that's very powerful when it comes to helping with stress. I feel like often in our culture, it's very embedded to just be hustling, like work hard, and even if if you slow down, I feel like it's always the typical phrase that at least my mom would always say to me, "Te corre la sangre muy fría," which means like
Okay,
your
I don't
blood
know
is
that.
not like going super fast, like come on, let's get going. And so it's always like I feel like we're always hustling and we never actually take the time to actually think and reflect and have that mindfulness. So I really, really think that yoga is something very important because it helps with mental health. And we all know that stress can cause a lot of other diseases. And, in the Latino community, there's a lot of chronic diseases. So, starting from the beginning, it's always very crucial. So the earlier, the better. But having that said, I do know that a lot of people in the community, the Latino community, don't like to seek therapy or any sort of help just because for different reasons, but mainly the reason is because it's said to believe that it's for people who are crazy, who need the medication, who are very sick mentally. But I, for one, don't believe that because, we all need to talk to a friend when we feel like something is going wrong with our life. We all need sometimes, even I go to the priest and, I do my confession and I'm just like, hey, so what do I do? Or just letting anything out because, if you boil it in, it's actually not very good. So how do you deal with being able to tell the community that's not what it is, it's more of like you talking to somebody and it's all confidential, there's like nothing that will tell you that you're crazy, how do you tell them that it's okay?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of layers to that, so I want to be really intentional to try and address them all. And yeah, I think that is such an important question. To start out with, I know you mentioned, this idea of like, oh yeah, you got to be hustling, because that's the way it is. And what I'll say is that, for a lot of cultures who have been influenced by Eurocentric and colonial values, that has become an ideal. And at the same time, that's not the way that our ancestors lived. And when I say our ancestors, you can go through any culture back in time, and there was more connection with the earth, with community, with one another. And so, I do try to remind folks, one, like just from that standpoint, and I'll address the other parts too, but that this isn't necessarily how it ought to be or how it should be. There's a lot of pathology or mental illness that's coming up in society. And the way that from a feminist multicultural perspective views it is that is society that's ill. That's not the individual that's ill. And so, a lot of work that I do is in decolonizing work and in recognizing that, the systems it's important to recognize the systems instead of pointing, the finger at the symptoms that are coming up in the individual. So yes, there's that piece of we need mindfulness, and that's important. And each of our ancestries, each of our cultures have valuable wisdom that goes back before, modern Eurocentric society said that it had to be a very specific and rigid way to be valuable. So there's that piece. In terms of engaging, Latinx communities or other BIPOC communities too, where there's skepticism of mental health, I want to acknowledge that, I think it's a really healthy skepticism. Historically, as I talk about colonialism and Eurocentric oppression, this relates to white supremacy and anti-racism work that's being done as well. A lot of folks of color have been abused and harmed by systems of medicine and mental health. And so I think that it's really important to acknowledge that skepticism and honor that. That's a way of folks trying to keep themselves and their families and their future generations safe. With that said, I've had the privilege of working with so many psychologists of color, so many different professionals across fields. I mentioned I work with educators and social workers and so many different professions. And there is an increase in representation happening. And I think that is absolutely essential to increase trust in the field and also to increase the voice of BIPOC folks, of Latinx folks, of folks from historically oppressed communities in shaping the field and in shaping treatment that's going to be most caring towards folks who are currently skeptical about it. And so what I'll say is, increasing accessibility, I think it's important to see oneself reflected in providers, in researchers, in what's out there. And so I've worked with, the Latinx community in therapy settings and in education settings for many years, and it's one of my specialty areas. And I hear so often, just knowing that I can provide services in Spanish, being able to even speak Spanglish with me if some folks don't want to speak, Spanish, like doing English-Spanish mix, or just knowing that at least part of my ancestry is shared. There's a lot of ease and comfort that comes up there. And so, ultimately in therapy research, which a lot of it is Eurocentric and colonial, says, ultimately, it doesn't matter necessarily if your provider matches your ethnicity or race. If you stick through therapy, the outcomes are the same. And at the same time, there is research that also says, BIPOC folks are less likely to continue a lot of times if their provider doesn't match their race or ethnicity. So it's like, if you can get through that initial hurdle, sure, like there are similar outcomes. And nonetheless, I think that, what's most important is you feeling comfortable with your provider. So, for folks from historically oppressed communities, you may hear, providers say like, oh, it doesn't, ultimately the results are the same, but the process is really important for the client. And so I think it's really important to honor that and to find a provider, that mirrors your values, that makes you feel comfortable and safe. It may be, someone of similar race or ethnicity. You might try it and be like, what, this isn't a good fit. And there's lots of providers out there. So, that's one thing that I say, if folks are skeptical, that's healthy, that's understandable. Know that things are changing, that there are so many providers who are advocating for the well-being of folks of color and historically oppressed communities. And, listen to your intuition and trust that, and find providers who are willing to, support you in the way that you need.
I feel that's very important. And I really like how you said that self-reflection is also very important, because when you see someone who can be from your same background, had the same barriers, hurdles that I had to jump over, you feel like you can trust that person into taking care of you. Because if they were able to make it past all of these hurdles, then that means that that person can also help you. So I think that that's very crucial what you say. And it is true, the endpoint at the end of the day is the same, but the process is what actually makes the difference. And if you don't have that like patient relationship where you understand the person and make them feel less skeptical and more comfortable, then it's not really going to matter as much. It's not going to have as much significance. And then as well as being able to put the first step is also being comfortable. So I think when you see someone who you feel they will understand you, because I recently heard someone previously say, oh, they're not going to understand. They're just going to tell me the same thing. And I understand because it was probably the provider, not the same race. Mm-hmm. So I know my mom had a different turnover when she was being seen by this provider who basically would say, you can't eat any tortillas, nothing. And it was Christmas break and, it was and it's like, I can't eat anything for Christmas, And then so she saw another provider that was also a Latina. And she was like, you know what? I know the traditions and in my family is the same. I know that you have to taste all the tamales because there's like 10 flavors. And it's like, just limit yourself to like 2 and then cut them in half, and that way you get to taste half of each and then just share the other half with the others. That way you're not like out of like being together with the family. You can still be part of everything. You can taste everything too. So I think that understanding of culture and how everything is actually eased my mom and was more comfortable with sharing like, like this is gonna happen, and I'm sorry. And the doctor being like, it's okay, I understand. How about we do this? This is the game plan. Instead of saying, you know what, absolutely not. You're going to not have that. You're going to have a horrible Christmas, I feel like it's important. It's very important. And especially here in San Diego, there's a big Latino community and other races as well. So
yeah. And one thing, I'll add to that is, I think this quality, whether it's, working with same race or same ethnicity providers or clients, I think at a minimum, shared community values, at least in really major ones, because I work with clients from a lot of different races and ethnicities. And one thing that I find, especially working with BIPOC clients, is, there's a sense of ease when they know that I care about them and I'm going to take care of them like their, family. And that's, I think what comes up in the Latinx community, at least from my own experience with my family and in my training and in my work with clients and communities, it's like, you want to know that this person genuinely cares about you and your well-being and is not going to look at you as someone, like you're saying, who's like pathological or crazy, but see you as a whole person and who's going to, give you that authentic attention and presence. And so, I'll say that, it may be, same race, same ethnicity. And at a minimum, it's someone who gets it, someone who understands the values that you're coming from, that your family comes from, what's meaningful to you, and doesn't make assumptions based on what might be, majority. It said majority versus minority. Honestly, I think minorities comprise like quite a bit of the US population. So, what
has changed.
Yeah, things are changing. But yeah, so, rather than what comprises, what's considered the mainstream kind of values. So, I'll put that out there that those shared values can present across races and ethnicities, of course. Like so many communities have beautiful values and I mean, almost all communities except for oppressive ones. And so, it's like finding that common ground and making sure that you and your provider share those values, I think is really important for building that trust.
Yeah, I just love like how, I think you briefly mentioned it, like how patients would need to identify as the same ethnicity as a provider in order for follow-ups. And then that kind of shows like where we should be aiming to solve. We should not be, telling these patients like, oh, it's not something that, you should not be stigmatized. Like you should not be thinking that way. Rather, we're telling the society, saying we should be advocating for more of these, providers to provide more variety and like depth of counseling services, just because there's definitely that some human touch that, like as Scarlett said, only that culture can face. Like for me, I'm from Korea, so I was grown up till age of 18. So like when I go to a counselor, I always worry about losing face and then, thinking that I might look weak, like less stressful. I think it's the same for different cultures, like maybe in cultures. But if I know Korean, like maybe Asian provider who's going to say like, it's okay, I would like really feel that like from a family's perspective, because like it's like a big brother telling me that it's okay, not who might I don't want to, but I might think that, oh, they don't know what I'm talking about.
100%. I think that can be so healing. And like y'all mentioned, increasing that representation, the community and in providers gives those increased opportunities for that corrective experience, for providers to shift the dynamic for folks who are seeking services and to be able to offer that. Because sometimes even within our own cultures, there can be harmful messages, and a lot of times those are internalized trauma, internalized oppression from, Eurocentric colonial places. And nonetheless, when someone from our own community gives us that care and validation, it can mean a world of difference. So I 100% can understand and resonate with that.
Okay. Probably, why don't we shift gears here and then talk about, pretty sure you had days when you were a college student, high school student, who had all these, conflicting values. I think you briefly mentioned you're from a different multicultural perspective, you have all these interests. And if there were any challenges that you want to highlight that was kind of stressful for you and like how you were able to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that identifying as someone who is community oriented and feminist, multicultural oriented means that, I'm on a lifelong journey for advocacy and humbling myself and growing. And so, yeah, in the advocacy process, I've worked in a lot of systems, mostly like educational systems, community systems, and I'm really passionate about dismantling oppressive parts of those systems. And, in many perspectives, systems themselves can be oppressive depending on, what they look like and where they're located, and what their function is. And so in being someone who advocates for change, there's naturally a lot of resistance to that. Yeah. So I am someone who, something changed when I was in college. I think, I had the privilege of having a lot of really amazing instructors, and I was kind of, talking with some folks, reflecting, found a lot of white cis hetero male instructors who have actually like really uplifted and empowered me to have a voice. So I'm like, when we think about, there's definitely been situations where, I've had opposite experiences, but I have had some really amazing professors who have, taught me a lot about advocacy, about community organization, about humanitarianism and making a difference in the world in college. And for me, it helped me be a lot more outspoken and recognize like there's a lot of stuff that's really effed up going on and like things need to change. And so, from college on, I've been like fairly outspoken. I used to be like pretty shy about speaking up about those kinds of things. And even, requires our own inner work to see what the heck is going on around us, to see what isn't working. And so, yeah, I'll say, most steps of my, education process and a lot of, different areas of advocacy, there is resistance. And I imagine a lot of folks, folks are listening who are also advocates, you will meet resistance. That's what comes up in response to change. It's like a system is like, whoa, what the heck is threatening like our current state of being? Work and growth is really hard. And when people are fatigued, it's hard to be receptive to that. And our society makes it such that most people are really freaking tired because they're exploited and overworked and don't have access to the resources they need to, be in tune with their authentic humanity in a lot of ways. And so when change comes, people are like, I don't want to do extra, like I barely have enough to give right now. And so, it's a really nuanced dynamic. In terms of like, holding compassion for folks who are being exploited by the system and also upholding the system, and then also being really intentional and holding fierce love for what needs to be changed so that more and more people aren't harmed. And so, yeah, I'll say that those are challenges. And I imagine other folks can relate. And, I've had communities that I've received support from throughout my education and, continue to receive support from. I think as anyone who identifies as an advocate, it's really important to be in touch with that. And I've had my mentors who I connect to, and I'm just so inspired by all the work that they do in the world. And so, for me, even their belief in me over the years has just kind of kept me going. And so, finding those people who kind of like help to relight you up, to keep you lit up, and communities who are like, yeah, I know what you're going through. This sucks. Like, this is really hard. And then that nourishment of self, for me, I spend a lot of time in nature, and I've got my little dog sleeping here in the room and with my family, and, try and practice that yoga, that connectedness to like the world, and also connect to my ancestry and my roots to keep me going through that. But yes, it's a process.
Like just that simple word of encouragement, like from who you look up to, just makes a world of difference. Like you feel like you're going the right way because you always doubt yourself. That's always the case for me. Like whenever I'm doing something, I always look at the consequences when speaking up. Like, would this look bad on me? How would it backfire? Like I think of all these consequences, but when there's someone, it doesn't have to be a mentor, I guess, but someone who really supports my values and just saying like, hey, you're doing the right thing. Like you're doing not only for yourself, but for the community. That kind of gives you assurance that, yeah, this is worth the path that I'm going through.
Mm-hmm. And, with that, I know you said it doesn't have to be a mentor. Also, if you find mentors, like why the heck not? I think it's so valuable. We talked about finding therapists who resonate with us, mentors. Like therapy is, in its current form, a more modern construct. Historically, people have sought support and healing and connection from one another. And for me, my, mentorship relationships have been so empowering, so healing. And I've been really fortunate to, have a lot of inspirational mentors. And so I recently attended a decolonizing conference that talked about, the healing and empowering benefits of especially like mentorship that's intentional to decolonize the process and be empowering of mentees. And, I think if you can find good mentors in this world in your journeys, then it can make all the difference, like you're saying. And it doesn't have to be a mentor. Nonetheless, like they can really help too.
Yeah, thank you for being our listeners' mentors right now.
So going on what Jinho had said, so it brought to me the whole imposter syndrome. I know a lot of famous people and powerful people who suffer, including Assembly woman Lorena Gonzalez had said that she also suffers from imposter syndrome, that where she sometimes feels like when she walks into the room and she feels like she doesn't fit in, that she is actually not adequate to be there, but then she says she reminds herself that no, she deserves to be there. She did all of her education, and just because she's a Latina doesn't mean that she doesn't belong. Yes. And and I sometimes feel like that too. Like sometimes I even self-doubt myself. I'm like, do I actually know what I'm doing? Like so how do you help those students that come to you and have all this self-doubt? Because I know when I was in college, I was all over the place. I was like, should I even be here? Like, not like I was one of the few from my high school that actually went to a university, and I'm like the first gen. Nobody else did. No one in my family, my cousins, I was just alone there. So I was constantly self-doubting if I should even be there. How do you help those students who have these doubts?
Yeah. Well, in terms of like general information, again, this is not direct therapy. This is just information, right? With imposter syndrome, one thing with my approach to therapy is, being kind of like y'all mentioned, like being a mentor in this setting, from the feminist multicultural perspective, there are roles of like mentorship within therapy. And I share like, heck, I experience imposter syndrome all the time. I think that's so human to have that whenever we're growing, whenever we're trying new, whenever we're pushed to like kind of new edges of what we had been able to do before or what we thought we could do before, those doubts come up. And, I think within that, it's also important to recognize, just like I mentioned earlier, there can be a lot of nuances and intersections of a lot of systems that exist today, including, current academia in the United States and many parts of the world, were not created for BIPOC folks. We're not created for historically oppressed folks, historically, at least in, the last maybe couple hundreds of years. And we're actually very intentionally created to keep those folks out. And so I think that it's important to recognize that kind of like reality, that I think that those messages still very much do exist on a subconscious level, if not overt levels. I think, a lot of universities are doing their very best to like, change that and make spaces more inclusive and representative and welcoming and safe and supportive. And nonetheless, I think that it's also important to just recognize, those injustices that have historically existed in these places. So just like you mentioned, for the representative, it's like, those spaces, especially in the United States, were not created for Latina women. Hell no, they were not. They were created for white men. And so, I think that it's really important to recognize that. And that's part of, the advocacy piece. I'm like, we can keep, changing this. And with imposter syndrome, regardless, I think any human would experience that, with something new. For me, kind of taking on that mentor kind of stance, I try to remember, what I'm in service of in what I'm doing. Like if I'm giving a presentation, when I give like larger presentations, sometimes I get really nervous. And I'm like, what am I in service of? Like, I'm in service of communities. I'm in service of like liberation. I'm in service of like helping people find peace. And that's the yoga practice for me too, is like coming back to that remembrance of like what's beyond me as like an individual. Like this isn't about me, like, Kristina, like as like a one person. It's about the community, and that helps me, diffuse some of that worry. Nonetheless, I totally have presentations where I'm like, what did I say? I think that went well. And, you know, we just roll with it. We just grow and push ourselves, and you know, also honor what's going on behind the scenes too.
Is it just me, like when I hear like people like who I speak to, when they just admit their vulnerability, their weakness, it just makes me feel like I'm not alone, and like people who have achieved so much still has that feeling. Kind of makes me, you know, heartwarming, I guess. I don't know. It kind of sounds weird, but
and it kind of also goes back to the whole idea of self-reflective, like seeing someone. So it goes back to like if someone shows you their vulnerability, it's kind of like, okay, we're the same, you know. Like you might be like when Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez said that, I was like, okay, you know, so I can relate to that, you know. If she has it, then, and if I have it, you know, it just makes us human, like Kristina had said. So it kind of gives us a sense of ease, and I think that's very helpful.
100%. And in, you know, the work of decolonizing kind of like how we present ourselves and professional roles. Professional is like, as it's practiced today, Eurocentric construct. You know, I think that vulnerability and realness is so important. In our communities traditionally, like we didn't hide from each other. Like it wasn't like, let me pretend to be this or that. And so, you know, it really is about like sharing knowledge with one another, supporting one another, you know, reciprocal exchange and like livelihood. And so I 100% agree with that. And when my mentors have shared things like that, and even when they share like resumes or things for me to look at, even from like, I had one mentor share like some early on resumes for their job applications. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could see them over the years. And like, they were willing to share when they were first starting out. Right. And that was like, oh, it's okay for me to like not totally get this. And like, you know, people make mistakes who are in like baller positions right now. And like, it's for me, you know, I try and do my best to offer that to folks who I work with too.
Yeah. I think changing the system to be more inclusive and have more diversity, it's very important, because it just helps us all see that we're not different. That just because you're in a higher position doesn't mean that you didn't go through like the same things and fears, doubts. So I think that's should be spoken and, you know, like said, because, you know, you might not know if something you say might actually help someone, and it makes you more approachable too, in a sense.
Yeah, maybe going off on that. So I think we're hyped about, you know, meeting people like you. I'm pretty sure this kind of helped me ease my, you know, mental barrier of, you know, finding these counselor services like CAPS. So how can we reach you? Like, how should we contact you? And then who should be contacting the counselors?
Yes. So in terms of reaching out to CAPS, one thing I usually recommend to folks, especially as we've talked about, you know, communities where there might be skepticism about mental health care, if you go on our webpage, there is a list where you can look at our staff and read bios for each provider. So there's photos of providers, there's bios, talks about treatment approaches and philosophies. For me personally, like if I were looking for a provider, that's something that's really important for me. And I think it can increase a sense of safety and just like motivation and connectedness to the process. After that, you know, for scheduling with CAPS, you just call the front desk. I'm like, I can share the number. I mean, I can share the number, but I'm like, I don't know if people remember. I guess they can just rewind the podcast.
Like description for everybody to click on it or call.
Yeah. So it'll be shared in the description. All you do is call the front desk and say you want to schedule a brief telephone assessment. And that's kind of like where you start the process. Then you will get scheduled for a 20-minute phone assessment to see, you know, is CAPS going to be a good fit to meet your needs, to learn about other resources available through CAPS and on campus. And if you might benefit more from like a referral off campus for more frequent therapy or a specialized kind of therapy that wouldn't be offered at CAPS, then they would provide that support in the brief telephone assessment. And sometimes that happens down the line too, where you might start and be like, yeah, you know, maybe this is a good fit. Maybe I need different support. And what I let folks know too, I let all my clients know this, is if you do end up working with a provider at CAPS, one, you can request providers with certain identities or certain specialty areas. So I do get a lot of students who request like bilingual, like English, Spanish providers, or like Latina providers or women of color. And so like I get a lot of referrals for that. You can make those requests. And if you do, for some reason, get matched with someone who doesn't feel like a good fit, you can always call the front desk and just ask to transfer. You don't have to give reasons. So I like to let folks know, don't let that be a barrier. Just like we talked about the importance of feeling connected to your provider and feeling like your values are heard and shared. You have those rights and opportunities as well.
Oh, wow. I just didn't know that it takes 20 minutes for the initial assessment. I was thinking, 5 minutes and then, it's going to be done, but it's like a more intensive 20 minutes to assess what's the best for you.
Well, yeah, I'll say, if you're scheduling to schedule the phone assessment, that'll take like 5 minutes or less. But the phone assessment itself, it is important to get an idea because then you can get resources that are, a good fit for you sooner than later. If you do end up getting scheduled for like the next step at CAPS, which is the initial evaluation, then that will be probably a couple of weeks down the line. And that's a longer, like approximately 1 hour assessment to get like a really comprehensive understanding of what's going on. And so, there's different steps to the process depending on what student needs are. And it could involve, being scheduled further at CAPS. It could involve off campus. We've also got therapy groups, which a lot of research shows is like just as effective as one-on-one. And I always tell folks, like historically, humans have healed in community. So, groups make a lot of sense to increase that. And then we also have drop-in spaces like workshops and community forums. I lead one that's called Latinx Chicanx Cafecito Hour. There's other ones for different, specific identities. And then, workshops that are drop-in that you don't have to kind of like even go through the brief telephone assessment for.
Wow.
So quick question. So I know that you talked about the telephone. So does that mean that there's no campus walk-ins?
Well, right now we aren't doing walk-ins for those brief telephone assessment. Yeah, I would say, I'm hopeful that we'll have walk-in options, coming up soon. For the assessment, though, we do have, a lot of students who are seeking services. So that helps us make sure that, if a student's reaching out that, they're going to be scheduled for the next one available. So yeah, for walk-in services, I think everything's in transition with like back to in-person. So I think that, you'll have to stay tuned for that. I know that we're working on stuff, and as soon as we have information, we'll share it with the campus community for sure. But I don't have an answer for that right now.
Yeah, I was just asking just in case there's someone listening that wants to walk up and like ask information. But, but yeah, hopefully things now start to be a little bit better, and in person sometimes is a little bit easier as well. So
yeah. Well,
but
what I'll say is that, as things do open up, we do have providers at like the different colleges. And I know that we're going to have a provider at like, we also have providers at some of the different like multicultural centers and different places on campus. So if you go to our website too, there's a list of like places we're connected to. So in terms of walk-ins, like when we are back to in person, and again, I don't have the exact answer, but stay tuned. Under construction. As soon as that happens, and if someone's door is open and you're like in like the cross-cultural center, something like that, of course you can drop by and say hi. Like those things are totally appropriate. That's why we're like in the community, so that we feel approachable and accessible to students. We can't necessarily like guarantee like a walk-in appointment, but if you just want to see a friendly face, and if you are near CAPS Central Office when we are back in person, like I don't see any reason you couldn't walk in and ask questions, and there's always flyers and stuff there. So in that sense, I just don't know when that will be, when all the on-campus in-person stuff.
COVID.
Yeah, I know.
So like maybe like to bring up my vulnerability, like recently with all the AAPI Asian American Pacific Islander hate going on in the country, I sometimes feel kind of very vulnerable in living in the US, I guess, as a like as an Asian, not even Asian American, like as an Asian, are there any like resources that you would recommend for those who feel the same as I am?
Yes, most definitely. So we do have on our webpage, I'd have to pull that up. I know we have like a help center that includes resources for like ethnic and race-based stressors going on. CAPS providers in general, we can offer students like a whole list of different resources, especially for folks experiencing, Asian hate and those feelings of, stress and potentially trauma that are coming up in response very naturally and understandably. I would say that going to our website, there's like a help center web link that includes those resources for ethnic and race-based stress. And you can always also like reach out to CAPS and say that, you want like a more like personal list of resources, and we can send stuff your way too. It would be, I can definitely, share stuff for y'all to share if you'd like. I have some resources that one of our CAPS psychologists put together. Just like, it'd be too much to like, I can't comprehensively list everything like verbally, but I'll give it to y'all so you can share it. But we have a great list of resources specifically for folks experiencing anti-Asian hate right now.
I guess just when in doubt, just call the number, get assessed. They'll direct you to nice resources.
Yeah, and the website has a lot of really great resources too. We also have a great self-help page with like access to the Headspace app, and even some like self-guided apps where you can do like therapy kind of like workshop or worksheet kind of things on like an app, and you can do like self-guided practices. So, I'd say scope around on the website if you're interested in the resources, and folks at the front desk 100% can always help too. I know that just calling for a lot of folks, especially these days, calling's not like such a normal kind of thing, so the website's totally okay too. The front desk does get emails and stuff. For anything urgent, we do have urgent care, so you can always call the front desk, and after hours you just press 2. There's always someone available, but for non-urgent stuff you can also email or reach out to whatever contacts are on our webpage.
Got it. So the reason why like we wanted to have you also, because we were reading your bio as you suggested, we were looking at the photo, and then we had a nice conversation with Dr. Anita Raj, who's a director of Center of Gender Equity and Health. She just told us that it's really like heartbreaking to see all these first-gen, second-gen college students getting sometimes sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, and then it just takes a huge toll on them just because they cannot really disclose it to their parents, just because of they have a huge expectation for them to succeed, and then just the cultural thing, not able to, as we discussed, to get help from these organizations. So we were just wondering, if somebody discloses those things to you, what would be the great resources or like your therapy recommend?
Yeah, well, I think that it can depend, so much on each, survivor's experience and, what they're wanting. So from the trauma-informed perspective, I always see, what it is that my students are looking for in terms of support and what feels comfortable to them in terms of like discussing certain things. It's usually not a first step of like processing things all the way through of what occurs. Usually with trauma-informed care, we're wanting to assess resources, build up resources and social supports and connections, and increase, each person's sense that they can soothe themselves and ground themselves and, feel like they've got tools to work with. So that's usually kind of where it starts. Definitely, I know that y'all had even talked about before, in our previous discussions, Carrot Sark. So I think that that's a great resource on campus. The more folks that you can have on your team, the more a sense of community. A lot of evidence-based treatment for trauma survivors is around like interpersonal supports. And we know that from, age-old traditions, like ancient traditions. It's like when folks experience trauma, the community comes in to help and support. And so same, you want to be engaged with those resources. And so I oftentimes send students resources that I get from Carrot Sark's page. They have a great list of like grounding skills. I know they offer some like support spaces too. And then on my end, it's really seeing like where the student wants to go with the work, and it might not be directly related to the trauma. It may, have to do with that, but just empowering that each person has a choice in what they want for their healing.
The reason that it was brought up and it was important for me, and the reason why I contacted you, it was because I, in my experience, when it happened to me, I was in Santa Cruz, and I actually went in and seeking help, and the person who was helping me, which was their CAPS as well, said to me, "Why did you put yourself in that position?" So afterwards, for years, I always felt like it was my fault, that I basically had caused that upon myself, that it was my fault. And it wasn't until later that I was like, no, it was unacceptable. That shouldn't have happened. It's not okay. So it just was very heartbreaking that someone could say that, even though it took like a huge step, especially in my culture where, Latinos were like, oh, if you go, you're crazy. So I was like, okay, I took that step, and I just felt like instead of taking a step forward, I just took like a million back. But it did, so that's why I wanted to put out this resource for anyone, that they could be able to hear a voice, and especially coming from someone from CAPS, and then that is also a part of the community and an advocate, to know that it is a safe space, and that there's no judgment, and it's not okay, and it's okay to talk about it.
Yes, 100%. And it breaks my heart to hear that was a response, especially when, you're reaching out for support from someone. And so, I say to anyone who's ever had that, experience, like, you deserve to feel supported, you deserve to be heard, you deserve to be validated, and 100% you deserve to be believed and not questioned. And so, if anyone out there is like experiencing that, just like I said, with any provider, you can always transfer providers. Like, you do not need to stay in, a therapeutic relationship either that doesn't feel like it's supportive, and that can even feel harmful. So I 100% support that. And a lot of my work with trauma survivors is, supporting their trust and their intuition, because so many times with trauma that can be left invalidated and questioned, and especially in a society that I guess puts out so much shame towards trauma survivors, right? The victim blaming and shaming, and even saying victim. Like, I use the word survivor because, everyone has so many strengths and so much resilience to be, going forward in any way that they're able to. And so, 100%, I support listening to your intuition. If something feels wrong, like screw that. Like, you deserve to feel like you're being empowered and uplifted.
Now, it's always a big question among every single person. If they do come, is it confidential? Is it going to be shared? Because sometimes that person is not ready to actually talk about it, let alone have like family members know. I know I was terrified to tell my mom because I thought I was my fault and that I caused this. So I was like, oh no, I'm like shamed of this, Is it confidential?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say I'm going to address that in 1 second and just wrap up the last part that, you mentioned the shame, and like, I'm just still wrapped up from that provider's response, but looking for trauma-informed providers will help give you that information also, that they have training or expertise in trauma-informed care, which is hopefully never going to bring about those experiences. And also feminist multicultural providers. Those are, great things to keep in mind, but especially trauma informed. And related to confidentiality, as mental health providers, for, disclosures of sexual assault, sexual trauma, that's not something that we're mandated to report or anything like that. The only times that we break confidentiality is if folks disclose immediate risk of harm to themselves or others, or abuse of children, elders, or adults who depend on others, or situations where there's like some serious legal proceedings. Those are situations where, you know, we may have to disclose information for reports of sexual trauma. The exception would be, you know, if they were a minor, or if there was a minor who might be being abused, then, you know, we would have to make reports to make sure that that doesn't happen, because a lot of times those can be like repeat offenses, and we want to make sure that we're keeping people safe. So, you know, it's not the same as if you're on campus where there's Title IX in other places, like outside of the therapy setting, because in some cases, if you do share with, you know, different folks on campus, they are required to make a report. But as therapists, we have a different level of confidentiality that's bound by like HIPAA, which protects, you know, client personal health information.
That's really reassuring to hear that. Like, confidentiality is such a huge thing. Like, that's what we do when we talk about different things. Like, is this gonna spread? Is this gonna affect me? But like hearing that therapy, and as you said, trauma trained counselor is the person who's going to be able to, you know, communicate and believe you, and also have the confidentiality that's really gives you a sense of assurance that that's in place.
100%. And I think that, you know, all that information is so important, especially for trauma survivors, to have transparency, because that helps to increase a sense of safety and trust.
Do you have any words to add, Scarlett?
No, just that. Thank you so much for taking your time and for helping us give out some resources and support everyone who's probably feeling in a certain place or a certain way, and giving them a little bit of information, resources, like I said. I feel like I'm rambling right here, but
that's all right. And I'll send even more stuff. I'm, you know, even thinking like, I'm someone who like over time, more and more things come up. There's some great like trauma informed like yoga resources. I've been reading a book on restorative yoga for ethnic and race-based stress. That's amazing. And so, you know, I'll send some stuff your way that you can post that you probably don't even know about yet, because I haven't emailed them to you. So there'll be great resources.
Yes, bring them all to us.
We'll be on the lookout.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for being here with us, and then Jinho as well for being here with me.
Yes, thank you for all that y'all do for the community and for inviting me. It's been an absolute honor. I'm so glad that there are these resources for students to feel empowered and to hear voices, to hear her voice. And you know, I think it's a huge service what y'all are doing, and I'm excited for your futures as activists and advocates and everything that you do as well. So thank you for inspiring me too.
Yeah, it's a lot of nuance happening that I feel like, you know, we should all just embrace it and just give it a go, and, you know, as you said, have everyone hear her voice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And then we'll be sending you this recording once it's edited. But other than that, do you have anything to add on?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah.
Anything you like to add on, Kristina?
Any comments to the listeners or?
Oh my, that's a lot all at once. Trust yourselves, remember your ancestors, and, you know, connect to the earth. There's a lot of healing there.
Will do.
Thank you so much, and we'll stay in contact.
Most definitely. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Hearing Her Voice is brought to you by Women's March San Diego at UCSD. The podcast is written and produced by Scarlett Lopez and Jinho Jung. Our design director is Melissa Wang. Our creative director is Suri Insunza, and our technical director is Catherine Cordova. To learn more about Women's March San Diego at UCSD, please visit our website on Linktree. Subscribe to Hearing Her Voice on Anchor app or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you.